On this episode of Cosmic Sponge, the Pentagon releases a report detailing the physical impacts of human interactions with UFOs, including teleportation, telepathy, injuries, and pregnancy. A time traveler shares information on both Bigfoot and the World Cup Championships coming this summer, 2020. And finally, in our main topic, we conclude our investigation into the Roswell crash, for now. Oh, and what looked like intentional governmental exclusion of werewolves may be something far more sinister than just speciesism. Because they say it includes encounters with ghosts, yetis, spirits, elves, and other mythical/legendary entities.
Yeah, they pretty much got it all covered. Although I noticed they didn't have werewolves.
Yeah, that disappointed me.
You know, that may still be classified. So that's why whenever we reported on the werewolf being sighted in Virginia before, they were told, straight up no. It's because that's probably still classified.
That's right. Must be. Werewolves are above top secret.
Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, the podcast where we discuss UFOs and other weird wonders in the world. I'm Stephen Hawk.
And I'm Jimmy Coe.
Tonight, we are continuing our quest to get to the bottom of the Roswell incident mystery. This is part 2 of our special 2-part episode. If you haven't heard part 1, you should probably go back and listen to it. But we are going to do a little bit of a synopsis. If you're jumping in, this is the very first episode you've ever heard, then welcome to the show. Before we get into all of that, Jimmy, what's been going on this week?
I've been thinking about pregnancies.
Oh, man, you got my one story. I can tell already.
Oh, no.
It's a big story, so go ahead.
That's the one I found. But we've got to go. We got to have two.
I got another story.
Oh, you got another? Okay, cool. This is okay. The headline of this article that I have, now I don't know if you found it in a different place, but the one I found came from India Today, because I go to India for all my news. This is out of
India Today.
It's out of New Delhi. I think they picked it up from something here because it's a slow news week in India. Anyway, woman got pregnant after sexual encounter with alien, claims new U.S. defense report. Several witnesses have alleged that UFOs have had sexual encounters with humans and also left one woman pregnant. Now, it sounds weird. Does a UFO have sex with the woman?
Maybe.
Maybe the UFO is the alien. I don't know.
I mean, it could be some type of device, right? It's
a little
high
tiny
tech.
alien.
I mean, it's alien technology.
Sure.
Don't question it.
I'm not going to. The absurd claims were made in Pentagon documents from the Defense Intelligence Agency, as obtained and reported by The Sun. The report was obtained as part of a Freedom of Information request, and it is entitled Anomalous Acute and Subacute Field Effects on Human and Biological Tissues, and investigates the health impact on humans who have had paranormal experiences or injuries to human observers by anomalous advanced aerospace systems. Bizarre occurrences such as apparent abduction accounted for pregnancy, sexual encounters, experience of telepathy, and perceived teleportation, in addition to schizophrenia, apparently.
Well, I wonder if they uncovered the fact that you need to roll the window down when using telepathy. Kind of curious. Maybe they got to the bottom of why that is. I don't know. Yeah, this I read something on the same. I actually went to the direct source of this article, which is from The Sun. They filed a Freedom of Information Act. And if you get into this just a little bit, you realize that this report is the same one that we've had before from ATIP. Now, there may be something new here. I'm not aware. I haven't. Apparently, there's 1,574 pages from ATIP, the program we've talked about many times, the one that ran from 2007 through 2012, in which Lou Elizondo was the head of for part of that, and Christopher Mellon was involved, and they released the 2 Navy videos, and that's when it all broke. The New York Times broke that this ATIP program even existed. But if you recall, a few months ago, we reported on this group of scientists that were part of the group that Bigelow put together in Las Vegas, and they were looking at all kinds of things like strange propulsion and
Yeah, I like to refer to those as the ayahuasca papers, and included guys like Hal Putnam and Eric Davis.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know that this is really breaking news, and there may be something new in there, but they got some info from the Defense Intelligence Agency after filing the FOIA, so they may have just got their FOIA documentation in, but I'm pretty sure this is going to be some of the same documentation we talked about before. Because I remember the biological effects, the ionizing radiation. There were speculation about propulsion systems. There most definitely, I don't remember anything about the pregnancy, so that may be something new. But I don't think it's like Scully and Mulder went out and investigated this. I think these are just reports, maybe from MUFON or something. And if I'm not mistaken, that's where some of the information that they studied during ATIP came from some of the UFO organizations. So could just be people reporting these things. I don't know how much proof is there.
Oh, it's definitely, certainly. It is definitely.
Certainly.
It's definitely, certainly things from other people out there, because they say it includes encounters with ghosts, yetis, spirits, elves, and other mythical/legendary entities.
Yeah, they pretty much got it all covered. Although I noticed they didn't have werewolves.
Yeah. That disappointed me.
That may still be classified. So that's why whenever we reported on the werewolf being sighted in Virginia before, they were told, straight up no. It's because that's probably still classified.
That's
Must
right.
be.
Must be. Yeah. Werewolves are above top secret.
Well, I have another report from the future.
Oh, sweet.
A time traveler from 2743 predicts that there will be a Bigfoot sighting that unequivocally proves Bigfoot exists. Yeah, at some point in 2022. And also, one thing very important is that England will win the World Cup in 2022. Because we'll see. That's the way they're going to prove that they're a time traveler from 2473. Now, this 2743, I'm sorry, don't get confused. We had another time traveler a while back that gave us a report, if you recall, that on August 29th, 5 people will receive superpowers. But that was a time traveler from like 2432 or something. I don't remember exactly. So I'm not sure how all this plays out, between these time travelers. I'm not sure if that guy was from 2582. Yeah. But this new one's from 2743, so he's even further in the future. But one person said that they knew it was a hoax because they said England would never win the World Cup. So,
well, I mean, I think I'm one of those superhuman people. I think I have superpowers.
Oh, really? What's your superpower?
I'm able to teleport, but I can only teleport exactly where I am. It's instantaneous, so you can't tell.
My superpower is having perfect hindsight. I can predict the outcome of anything if I already know what happened.
With your memory, I think there might be some kryptonite nearby.
Yeah, remember that? What was that? Was it on South Park? Captain Hindsight. He would show up and say, "You shouldn't have done that. You should have built fire escapes on that building." Instead of saving anybody, he just shows up and points out stuff that they should have done. Right? Thanks again, Captain Hindsight. I look like a superhero moth flying in front of your lighting there.
That's what it was. It was coming around.
I hope he doesn't fly down in your wine glass.
Oh, that would be so.
Well, I see you haven't taken the spontaneous human combustion warnings very seriously.
Nope.
If they're guzzling wine again.
Yeah,
I hope there's no open flames nearby.
I've decided to take up smoking too, so.
You might just smolder for hours.
I might smolder for hours.
All right. So anyway, let's move on to tonight's main topic because we definitely have a lot to talk about. But before we get into that, I would like to ask everyone just to go to our webpage and check it out. I talk about this every week, but I bet there's some listeners that's never looked at CosmicSponge.com. We got some fun stuff on there. Jimmy does an extremely nice write-up on every single episode. Also there, we have a web store. You can go buy some t-shirts and coffee mugs and all kinds of neat stuff that have our logos on it. If you'd like to support the show, look in the upper right-hand corner. There's a little coffee cup icon. You can click on that for a one-time donation, and there's a little link next to the coffee cup, and that will take you to Patreon. If you want to support us through Patreon, they're very modest levels. You will gain access to another show that we do that is exclusively for our Patreons called Weird Wonders. Please remember to rate and review the podcast. It helps other people find the show. And Jimmy does a great job on Instagram.
Well, thank you.
Has some real funny clips on there. Go to Instagram and type in Cosmic Sponge and you'll find it. So it's usually making fun of me, but sometimes making fun of Jimmy.
Those are my best moments.
Right. And Jimmy, I know on Patreon too, you're working on the web comic. How's that going?
I only have
putting
two.
Those out once every couple of weeks or something like that.
Yeah, I have 2 up, but I have like 5 in the works, and I just got to finish them up.
If you need more Cosmic Sponge in your life, check it out. And also, we're on Facebook. So the stories we talked about tonight, I always post all my stories on Facebook, plus a lot of other stuff too. And we have a user group called Cosmic Sponge Theorist. If you would like to keep up to date with time travelers from the future and FOIA requests that reveal the government have studied alien pregnancies, then go to Facebook and check it out. All right, well, on to tonight's show. Again, this is part 2 of our Roswell episode. Last week, we gave a chronological rundown of where the story came from, the witnesses, and some of the people that have reported on this through the years. And of course, the story's changed and evolved somewhat. Been a lot of books written on it, a lot of documentaries done on this subject, and we're trying to get to the bottom of it. Tonight, we are going to look at the validity of each one of these things. But Jimmy, I think you've done a little legwork before tonight's episode on the Roswell incident. What do you got for me tonight?
Very little, but let's get started. Jim Ragsdale lay buck naked in the back of his pickup truck.
I knew it was going to be good.
Next to him, equally buck naked, was Trudy Truelove.
Hold on a minute. Trudy Truelove. Is this
I'm not making it up.
Is this like a storyline from a porn movie or something here?
It sounds like it, doesn't it? When I read it, I said, this has got to go in the show. The camping trip had gone well as far as Jim was concerned. Better even. He was just about ready for round 2 with Trudy when something large roared overhead and crashed about a mile from the porn-like lovemaking. Quickly, both Jim and Trudy got dressed and rushed to the crash site. The flashlights they had with them were flickering due to bad batteries and even worse planning. Being 11:30 at night, they couldn't see very much. So they decided, instead of looking for survivors, to go back to knocking uglies at the campsite and then return in the morning. As the sun rose, they returned to the crash site and started gathering debris. Again, ignoring a search for any possible survivors, possibly because they were psychotic. Soon, it wasn't too long before they heard a ruckus coming up the road. It was the Army, coming in trucks and flatbeds, apparently to get on site and collect all of the debris. They hid in their truck, parking their truck in a crop of trees, and observed the Army starting to gather up the debris and load the saucer on a flatbed. They decided to sneak away in their diesel truck, as it was sneakily quiet. In time, Trudy would eat a guardrail and die. The wreckage they had collected in her car lost to the salvage yard. Jim's alien wreckage would be stolen along with a handgun, fake mustache, and leather vest sometime later. His affidavits, that's right, he changed them as often as his underwear, of these events make for good reading, but little else. Many of these stories from the Roswell community would be collected well after the actual events took place. Perhaps we should go back to the beginning in order to find the true story of Roswell, rather than look to the future and do something else. I had something there, but I lost it. What was that? What was that future story you had?
Look to the future and
what was the future dude in the story you told me at the beginning?
Time Traveler 2473.
Yeah, what was he? What was his? Oh, that. Rather than look to the future and find a Bigfoot. There you go.
Right. Oh man. So I think I remember that story. Didn't they go on board the ship or something? And
yeah, in a later retelling the story by Jim Ragsdale, they actually went onto the ship, took golden helmets off of the dead bodies of the aliens, or maybe they were in the process of dying. It didn't seem like he cared. He took those helmets and buried them in the desert, but forgot where he put them.
Oh, so they're still out there somewhere.
And
Man.
you too can find them if you just go out and start digging holes in the desert with Shia LaBeouf.
Right. Just real quick, I want to go over to the history of how this story happened. In 1947, we have a story that was published in a local Roswell newspaper that the Army had found a flying saucer. This is 2 weeks after the initial sighting by Kenneth Arnold. A rancher named Mac Brazel had found this on his ranch that he managed. It's called the Foster Ranch. They kept sheep there. He had this wreckage and debris on his property since about the middle of June. Of course, this story has evolved depending on which story you read, which book you read. Later authors got into it and they would change the timeline around to try and make their stories fit. This is based on the original stories that we had for around 1980. So anyway, Mac Brazel finds this wreckage, doesn't think a whole lot about it. This debris sits around for a couple of weeks. He goes to Corona, the nearest town, which is 30 miles away. Now keep in mind, Mac Brazel lives a very isolated existence. He does not have a radio. He does not have a phone. He goes to Corona. That's when he first hears about flying saucers and UFOs. Everybody's talking about it because it's all over the news. He thinks, hey, maybe this is one of those flying saucers. On his next trip to Roswell, he goes by the sheriff's office, tells the sheriff. He says, hey, I may have debris to one of those flying saucers up on the ranch. About that time, the radio disc jockey calls. His name was Joyce, Frank Joyce. And he would call the sheriff every Sunday and ask him what's going on so he could report on it. So he hands the phone to Mac Brazel and says, here, tell him your story. So he tells him the story of maybe finding a flying disc or debris of one on his ranch. The sheriff says you need to go to the Air Force. Jesse Marcel and a counterintelligence officer, last name Cavett is all they can remember. Go up to the ranch, collect some debris, and spend the night. Well, in the meantime, while they're gone, and this event changes a little bit depending on which version you read, but while they're gone, William Haught, the public information officer from the Roswell Air Force Base, takes a news release to that radio station and hands it to Frank Joyce that says the Army has found this crashed saucer. So the story breaks. It's all over the country. It's all over the world. The phone's ringing off the hook. Everybody's like, they found a flying saucer in New Mexico. And then the next day, they return with the debris. They, in turn, fly the debris to Fort Worth, where the headquarters for the 8th Air Force are. And there, General Ramey and Jesse Marcel, General Ramey's assistant, Thomas DuBois, gather around and tell the press, no, wait a minute, this is just a weather balloon. And they have the debris there. And it looks like tinfoil and, sticks and stuff like that. The next day, in the Roswell Record, report the fact that, and I think that night, Ramey had gotten on the phone or gotten on the radio, told the public, look, this is just a weather balloon. Everybody calm down. This is not a flying saucer. And then the next day, the Roswell Record reports that it's just a weather balloon and not a flying saucer. And there's an interview with Brazel who says that he acknowledges what it was and it was sticks and tinfoil, and he describes the debris, and then the story goes away. After that, everybody seems satisfied. And then in 1978, Stanton Friedman finds Jesse Marcel, and Jesse Marcel comes out with this story that debris was actually a flying saucer, and that the Air Force covered it up with a story that it was a weather balloon, and that the Army's had this flying saucer, this crashed flying saucer, since 1947. Now, that had been 30 years, right? So this was 1978. By the time we get to 1980, there was a National Enquirer article published about it that interviewed Jesse Marcel. And then in 1980, the very first book that was published was called The Roswell Incident. It is by Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore. And also Stanton Friedman, the famous ufologist who broke the story, also did some research on the book, but he's not credited in it. Not as a co-author, but in the book, it shows that some of the interviews are from his research. And they interview Jesse Marcel, but also in this book, they find a story that's secondhand that a Charles Bartlett had found a crashed flying saucer with aliens aboard, and the Army showed up, gathered it all up, and sworn to secrecy and ran away. Now, that story was related to the investigators in 1980, and they said that this individual, Charles Bartlett, who had passed away, had related that story to them in 1950. So it had been It had been 30 years since they even heard the story, and it was secondhand. And then, of course, since then, all kinds of witnesses have come out. There's been other books. They've shifted the timelines around. They even had some conference in the 1990s. MUFON put on a conference to get all these UFO investigators and try to come to a consensus about, okay, now we need to get this all straight. You know, when did the second saucer show up? When did the aliens? What was the date? What was the timeline? And even now, the UFO community can't agree on when the events occurred. I mean, it's just evolved. And of course, in the mid-90s, Alien Autopsy came out. After that, it was proven to be fake. Of course, so many people believe that this stuff is true. I hate to say it, because when you do a podcast like this and you enjoy the mystery of the world, and I still think there's a lot of mystery in the world, I still think there's a lot of mystery in particular about flying saucers and UFOs. I truly do. And I know when you do a show like this that there's other shows, the History Channel, Ancient Aliens, that no matter what kind of claims that people make, they just go with it, right? They just speculate on it and just build it up even further. And if the facts doesn't fit your story, you just ignore the facts. You only report the things that agree with your narrative, what you want to say. So if I want to say there was a flying saucer that crashed in 1947 and it's been this huge government conspiracy since that time, and these witnesses, you know, whatever, death threats and all this kind of stuff, you know, we would probably be a more popular podcast. And maybe you're listening to it right now and you're saying, okay, well, it sounds like you're just going along with the government idea, but that's just not it at all. There's too many inconsistencies with the story, and that's what we're going to point out. And I'm sorry if I have any true believers out there that's listening, but as Jimmy and I had said when we very first started episode number 1 of this podcast, is we want to get to the truth. And I feel like we've done that on this story. So just tell you straight up, I don't think it was a crash flying saucer. I think it was Project Mogul. I think it was exactly what the Air Force says it was, and I'm going to tell you why. Don't know if Jimmy has anything he wants to add to that.
No, I think you covered a lot of the things I was looking at, talking about. We could go into them in a little bit more detail if we want to. I don't know where you wanted to head to next.
Well, listeners, Jimmy and I have both looked at quite a bit of the witness testimony and a lot of the stories. We don't have time to talk about all of them. I mean, we just don't. We'd have to make another probably 3 episodes to talk about every single point that has ever been brought up in a UFO book. So what we're going to focus on are the big ones. The main thing I want to look at is Jesse Marcel and his original story, because that's where it came from. Last week, I told you a little bit about him. This is all published in the very first Roswell book, The Roswell Incident, that was published in 1980. William L. Moore and Charles Berlitz published the book. There's some interviews also by Stanton Friedman. Major Jesse Marcel, he retired from the military as a lieutenant colonel. By all accounts, he served honorably while he was in the military. He was the intelligence officer. That's all verified. But there's a couple of things, and I pointed out one thing last week that stood out to me. You get the impression when you hear the Roswell story, Jesse Marcel returned to the base with this debris, and then everybody went out to see it, and that's when the story broke. That's when William Haught broke the story. But actually, the story had broke. It says so right here in the book. It says, and this is all from the interview from Jesse Marcel. What did you do with the material that you picked up? We collected all the debris we could handle. When we had filled the carry-all, which he's talking about a Jeep, I began to fill the trunk and back seat of the Buick. That afternoon, July 7th, we headed back to Roswell and arrived there in the early evening. When we arrived there, we discovered that the story that we had found a flying disc had leaked out ahead of us. We had an Eager Beaver PIO, public information officer, on the base who had taken it upon himself to call the AP on this thing. And then he goes on to say they had several calls on it that night. If you listen to the accounts now, if you listen to the narrative now, they make it out that Jesse Marcel and the CNC officer followed Mac Brazel out to the ranch, gathered this material up, and came back. And then they reported the story. Then it hit the AP wire. William Haught had actually saw the material, but William Haught released the story of the flying disc before they ever returned with the debris. Jimmy, last week you had said there was an interview, a deathbed confession, or an interview very late with Frank Joyce. He had talked to Mac Brazel, and Mac Brazel was saying it's the stench and there's the dead aliens and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
And that information comes to us from Donald R. Schmidt. But I will say that I saw Frank Joyce interviewed on a documentary. It's really good. It's on Amazon right now. It's called The History of UFOs. When he's interviewed, all he talks about is William Haupt bringing him this press release, because he makes a big point to say, hold on, wait. And William's like, no, I've got to get back to the office. And he waited. He makes a big point to say, I waited for him to get back to the office. And I called him and said, Walter, do you really want to run this story? And he said, the old man okayed it. So go ahead and run it. So that was the story about the flying disc that went out on the radio. Again, this is before they had returned from the ranch. But I think it's important because the deathbed confession is like, well, I had this interview with Mac Brazel over the phone, and they reconstructed it, that he's talking about aliens and the stench and all this kind of stuff. When you hear Jesse Marcel's testimony about what they went and looked at, it's just debris in the field. Now, he thinks it's a flying saucer, but there's nothing about alien bodies. So where did that come from? Of course, there's two different books that have other, where the crash site is. One's like near Socorro, another one's in another place. They are very far from the ranch, from Mac Brazel's ranch. And I think we'll find, as we get a little bit deeper into this, that some of the more outrageous claims come from the author, Donald Schmidt. And I have a little more to say about him. But I want to finish up with what's in the Roswell incident. Intelligence Officer Jesse Marcel. Now, they do a little introduction of Jesse Marcel. I read this last week, but I want to read it again. It's probably pretty important. So he was a ranking staff officer in charge of intelligence at the Roswell Army Air Base at the time of the incident. Marcel, now retired and living in Yuma, Louisiana, had been flying since 1928. Now remember, this book was published in 1980. He was still alive then. In his own words, was familiar with virtually everything that flew. As one of the few cartographers familiar with both the making and interpreting of aerial maps before World War II, he was sent to intelligence school by the Army Air Force following Pearl Harbor, and proved to be so capable a student there. Upon completion of training, he was retained as an instructor. 15 months later, he applied for and was granted combat duty and went to New Guinea, where he became intelligence officer for his bomber squadron and later for his entire group, flying as a bombardier, waist gunner, and pilot. He logged 468 hours of combat flying in B-24s, was awarded 5 air medals for shooting down 5 enemy aircraft, and was himself shot down once on his 3rd mission. So that's who's telling the story. That's where it comes from.
He was shot down in a bomber? Did he
what it says. I mean, it's possible.
Yeah, I know. Did he parachute out?
I'm assuming. I mean, I don't know. The way he tells stories, he may have just like landed in some brush or something and it broke his fall. Landed in a marsh or something. He didn't need a parachute.
Are you saying he wasn't shot down?
I don't know if he was shot down or not.
Don't they keep records?
There was an armchair researcher by the name of Robert Todd. And back in the 90s, he used to publish some newsletters all about the Roswell incident. Well, he filed a FOIA request, that's Freedom of Information Act request, and obtained Jesse Marcel's military records. And so here's some of the details about that we know from Jesse Marcel. He was born in 1907, where he went to high school. After high school, he worked as a draftsman for the Louisiana Department of Transportation, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He worked for Shell Oil Company as a cartographer. He specialized in making maps from aerial photography. He served 2 3-year enlistments in the National Guard from 1925 through 1928, then in Texas from 1936 through 1939. He and his family, wife and son Jesse Marcel Jr., were living in Houston, Texas when World War II broke out, and in March 1942, at the age of 35, he applied for it and was given a commission as a 2nd lieutenant in the United States Air Force. Based on his experience in mapping and analyzing aerial photography, the Army sent him to Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania for training as a combat photo interpreter and intelligence officer. Okay, that's pretty much what he said. Jesse did well in intelligence school. He actually became the instructor. Eventually, the Army granted his request for combat, and in October of 43, First Lieutenant Marcel found himself assigned to the 5th Bomber Command in the Southwest Pacific Theater. For the next 2 years, Marcel fought the war first as a squadron intelligence officer, then a group intelligence officer, participating in several campaigns that resulted in the retaking of the Philippine Islands. During his combat tour, Jesse performed his duties well. His commanders rewarded his work and abilities with 2 air medals, the Bronze Star, and a promotion to captain and then to major in May 1945. Once the war was over, he was reassigned in January 1946 to the 509th Composite Group at Roswell Army Air Force Base. Of course, that's the only air base in the world that had nuclear weapons. In July 1947, Marcel found himself at the center of attention when he brought the debris of a flying disc that Mac Brazel had found on the Foster Ranch. Later, in 48, he was transferred to the Strategic Air Command, where he was eventually put in charge of a Pentagon briefing room for the Air Force Office of Atomic Energy. He was responsible to make sure that charts, illustrations, etc. were produced and ready on schedule to maintain the organization of the briefing room staff. In January 1949, he signed a statement that he fully intended to continue his career in the Air Force, but in the following year, he received word that his elderly mother required assistance and that his sister could not provide. He requested a hardship release from active duty, and it was granted, and in July 1950, he returned home to Louisiana. Afterwards, he enjoyed his ham radio hobby, an electronic repairman specializing in televisions, transmitters, and receivers. When he was released from active duty, his commission as lieutenant colonel was transferred to the Air Force Reserves, and he eventually received his full discharge in 1958. He passed away in 1986 at the age of 79. That was his life in a nutshell. A couple of problems, though. In the book, he says that he had been flying since 1928. Meaning he was a pilot. Nowhere in his military records does it say he was ever a pilot. In fact, the FAA, which has complete records going back to well before 1928, does not have a record of Jesse Marcel having a pilot's license. His reserve officer career brief, which was dated the 20th November 1947, lists his flying experience as none. His classification questionnaire, completed and signed by Marcel in February 1942, goes out of its way. Now, this is when he was trying to enter the military and become a lieutenant. So you would want to put, an officer, you'd want to put all this stuff that you could do. I mean, the Army Air Corps, right? It goes out of its way to list talents such as photography and amateur radio, acting in high school and community plays, and singing in a quartet. But it doesn't mention anywhere his experience as a pilot.
Well, did he say he was a pilot, or did he say he was flying? Because if he said he was flying, maybe he was hitting the fungi, a little bit of ganj.
He was Superman, a superhero. He was flying.
He might have been flying high.
Well, and we're not digging into it too much, but I do want to mention that his military record says he was awarded 2 air medals, not 5. And there's no record that he ever shot down an enemy aircraft. There's absolutely no evidence in his personal file, which is almost 200, which supports him shooting down even one enemy airplane. And, there's some other things in there and some other, but I think those are the most important. On the surface of it, when I first read this and I first discovered this, I think, okay, the story broke because Stanton Friedman heard from another individual who said, you really need to talk to this Marcel guy because he handled those flying saucers when he was in the military. Well, we know that Jesse Marcel enjoyed his ham radio hobby, so I thought maybe he likes to get on the ham radio and embellish things a bit. Oh yeah, I shot down 5 enemy aircraft. Well, his record shows that he didn't. I was a pilot in the Army Air Corps. I used to fly B-24 bombers. I mean, it sounds a whole lot cooler, right? Than just to say, well, I looked at maps and I was a cartographer. Now, like I said, there's no evidence to show that he didn't perform his duties and do a good job. I mean, he was an officer and he was promoted. I mean, he retired as a lieutenant colonel, so he must have done a good job. But it sounds like he'd like to embellish his life a little more when he was young, especially World War II, right? You're a veteran, you want to have combat, tell people stories. But did he make up a story about finding a flying saucer?
He was certainly capable, based on all the available evidence.
Now you kind of think about it. You're like, well, maybe he just wanted to embellish the truth a little bit and tell a tall tale. I mean, some people just do that. Some people, and then once Stanton Friedman gets a hold of the story, and then it blows up and becomes the Roswell incident, there's all these articles and stuff. It's not like you can go back on it, right? I mean, once you start that ball rolling, you have to stick with that story forever.
You don't have to, but most people do.
Most people do. Well, I mean, look at the Valdez guy. He stuck with that story. You know, the one of what were they? Colombian, Brazilian,
Colombian,
Venezuelan, Venezuelan.
Yeah, south of the border.
Well, anyway, yeah, just like the Valdez Army sergeant said, he disappeared and then time traveled and traveled back, and he'd been gone for 5 days and all that. And it turned out it was just a joke. He waited until he got out of the military, I noticed. I guess maybe concerned about some disciplinary action, but it was, you know, he
met a guy. He met a guy that told him that England would win the World Cup in June of 2022.
Right. And Bigfoot will be proven without a doubt in 2022.
You know what? If Bigfoot is proven without a doubt in June of 2022, I'm going to totally rethink this whole thing.
Right. So I wanted to point out those inconsistencies with Jesse Marcel. He's the source of the original story. And he, I don't want to say lied, but maybe embellished the truth a bit about his military history.
No. If he said he shot down how many planes?
5 enemy aircraft.
And they recorded 1, that's a lie. Sorry, but...
They didn't record any. He was awarded 2 air medals.
Oh, so they record none. So one of 2 things is true. Either they didn't record it, or he lied. So those are the only 2. This is a binary choice.
Okay. Fair enough.
Just saying. Not to be mean about it, but let's be clear. So I have a question for you. So was it Jerry Marcel? Jesse, I'm sorry. I want to call him Jerry because I'm hankering for some ice cream. But did Ben and Jerry Marcel decide that he was going to... was he the one who said that the wreckage displayed in the famous photograph where he's holding up the wreckage was switched?
Right.
Was he the one who said that?
So whenever they get to Fort Worth with the material, he says... Just after we got to Carswell, Fort Worth, we were told to bring some of this stuff up to the general's office. That he wanted to take a look at it. We did this and spread it out on the floor on some brown paper. What we had was only a very small portion of the debris. There was a whole lot more. There was half a B-29 full outside. General Ramey allowed some members of the press in to take a picture of this stuff. They took one picture of me on the floor holding up some of the less interesting metallic debris. The press was allowed to photograph this, but were not allowed far enough into the room to touch it. The stuff in that one photo was pieces of the actual stuff we had found. It was not a staged photo. Later, they cleared out our wreckage and substituted some of their own. Then they allowed more photos. Those photos were taken while the actual wreckage was already on its way to Wright Field. I was not in these. I believe these were taken with the general and one of his aides. I've seen a lot of weather balloons, but I've never seen one like that before, and I don't think they ever did either. So what he's saying is all the pictures you see in all of the Roswell shows, everything that you've ever seen where they show Jesse Marcel holding up the debris, he's saying that's the actual UFO debris. He's saying that's the actual flying saucer stuff, right? This is the very first book written about it. Later, he changes his story, and he says that was cleared out. But this is the very first book written on it, and it says, I was holding up the actual debris. And I'm going to challenge listeners to look at a picture of what he's holding up and then look at a radar target and tell me that's not the same thing. Look at what he claims was switched out for the real debris and tell me it's not the same thing. He's holding up the debris and he's saying this was the real stuff, okay? The aluminum foil and the bamboo or whatever it is, the balsa wood. And then he says they clear the reporters out and clear everybody out and then bring in fake debris. And then General Ramey and Thomas Du Bois pose with the fake stuff. Well, why would they even do that? I mean, if they're going to take a few photos, what's the point of showing? I mean, it looks exactly the same.
So
because it is the same.
I have a couple of things I'd like to interject here. So the wreckage was collected in Roswell and flown to Fort Worth. From Fort Worth, it was collected by Colonel Thomas J. Du Bois. Is it Du Bois or Du Bois?
I know who you're talking. Yeah.
Du Bois. They have it written here as Dubose. Anyway, he's a retired brigadier general, was present when the wreckage was brought into Ramey's office. There's no disputing this fact. He met the B-29 personally when it arrived at Carswell Air Force Base, that's Fort Worth, from Roswell, carrying the debris that Marcel had collected. Not only did he collect it, but he hand-carried the wreckage in a sealed canvas mail patch, interestingly enough, immediately escorting it to Ramey's office. In a revealing interview with DuBose, he says that, no, the material was never switched. The material that was in the office was the debris brought directly from Roswell. And in a second and third interview, he repeated his assertion that no wreckage substitution had taken place. More importantly, by the time of the third interview, DuBose had looked at the photos of the recovered debris taken at that time by J. Bond Johnson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and others. DuBose recognized the material in the photos. Did you get a chance to read the material and look over the pictures? Yes, and I studied the pictures very carefully. And then he claims, yes, that's the material that Marcel brought into Fort Worth from Roswell. Now, it's not just DuBose who says this. He also presented the testimonies of Irving Newton, who was also present that day in Ramey's office, and Sheridan Cavett, who helped Marcel collect the wreckage from the ranch. And as if that were not enough, we go all the way back to the beginning. In the very first recording of this from Mac Brazel himself, he claims that on June the 14th, him and his 8-year-old son Vernon were about 7 or 8 miles from his ranch house. That's when they came upon a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, and rather tough paper and sticks. And then on July 4th, he, his wife, Vernon, and their daughter, Betty, who was at age 14 at the time, went back to the spot and gathered up quite a bit of the debris. Betty Brazel was then interviewed later and then goes on record as saying the material that they collected, the original material collected before Marcel showed up, before Cavett showed up, before anybody, they had already collected some of that material. They asked her if the picture that was displayed was showed the material that they collected, and she said, yes, that looks like the stuff that we collected.
And you know, here's something I think that's really important. So we have the testimony of Jesse Marcel, who did collect the material and says it's a UFO. It says it's a flying saucer. Okay, now we have the other guy, Colonel Cavett?
Oh, Cavett. Sheridan
Cavett was there, and he collected it, and he says, you know, it's this radar target stuff. It's a bunch of tinfoil and stuff. And then we have General Ramey's aide, DuBose, who says, yes, that was what we got. That's what it looked like. He was quite old by the time he was being interviewed as well. And we have Newton, who was called down to examine it and say, hey, what is that? And he recognized the radar targets, not because they were used on weather balloons, but because they were used in Project Mogul. And those same type of radar targets were used in Okinawa when he was stationed there in the war for like radar gun ranging. But it was something similar he was familiar with. We have one witness who says it's a flying saucer. All the other witnesses, including Marcel's daughter and son and all them, say, no, it's not. And then everything else you get is a whole bunch of people that came forward with a whole lot of stories from many years ago. A lot of them were children. I'm not sure why. And a lot of stories were secondhand. A lot of stories were third hand. And I'd like to point out that a lot of people are interviewed that aren't included in those books, in those promotional books, because it doesn't fit, right? It doesn't fit their story. It doesn't fit their narrative. So they don't want to include someone who says, oh yeah, it was the radar target. And I'll tell you something else. This is something that really kind of drove this point home for me. Was you and I have talked a lot about the movie The Phenomenon, made by James Fox. Now, I really like the movie. It's very well done. And listeners, go watch it. It's a great movie. The first time I watched it, I was pretty impressed because they had an interview from DuBose, Thomas DuBose, who was in that room. They have an interview and he says, General Ramey says this is above top secret and nobody is to talk about this. Okay? And they're doing this right after they do the interview with Jesse Marcel, who of course is from his old TV show appearance on In Search Of. And he's going, oh, there's so much of this debris and it's not of this earth and we couldn't bend it with a sledgehammer and all this stuff about the debris. And then they go they cut to DuBose, introduce him briefly. He's very old. He's probably 90 years old or something. And he's saying, General Ramey says this is above top secret. So that seems pretty impressive until you realize, and you know, I went back to watch it when we started doing this research because didn't that guy say, and then I realized he's just saying it's above top secret. He didn't say anything about a flying saucer. He didn't say anything about anything other than General Ramey says we don't talk about it. It's above top secret. That's because they're talking about Project Mogul. But the way it was edited in the movie made you just roll right through that and think, you know, in my mind, I'm like, he's talking about the flying saucer because that's what the edit was intended to do that. But where was the rest of the interview? You know, you just get those few words, those important words. As we can see, once we get into the government report a little bit, there's quite a bit of that. A lot of these witnesses said that they were misrepresented in these books, or they flat out didn't say what they've been quoted as saying.
Glenn Dennis, who we mentioned last week in our Roswell Cover-Up Uncovered Part 1, worked at a funeral home. And he was the one who went in and saw some of the wreckage, was reprimanded by some MPs, and then later had a conversation with a nurse on base that he had seen there who had come out of an operating room in the hallway. She had told him that he needed to leave immediately, but before he could, the MPs stepped in, and then a redheaded captain reprimanded him. And
of course he was redheaded, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, redheads are soulless people who go about demanding that everyone kowtow to them.
And of course,
I have personal experience here on this episode.
I'm a redheaded person.
Exactly. So I'm speaking from experience. So anyway, he claims that he has this conversation with a nurse on the base and says that the nurse conveys to him, even drawing some pictures, that she was part of an autopsy of some out-of-this-world creatures. Little alien creatures, 3 little fingers, suckers on the end of their fingers, big eyes, big heads, you know, the typical alien, the Greys. Now, this all holds up under no scrutiny, but once scrutiny rears its head, things start to fall apart for Dennis. Roswell researchers finally got Dennis to name his nurse friend, and he says the name was Naomi Maria Self. The morning reports that list all military personnel still exist at the Roswell Army Airfield for July of 1947, and they show there were only 5 nurses assigned to the RAAF during July of 1947, and none of these were suddenly transferred to England or anywhere overseas for that matter. Also, none of the nurses had the name Naomi Maria Self, or had any name resembling that name, not even close. I mean, even if you were to take it and use a Scrabble bag and shake it up and come out, you could get any name that even come close to any of the ones.
Yeah, maybe he should have went with something like Mary Smith or something. You know, probably
Jane Doe
would have had. Yeah, well,
yeah, it would have worked presumably before and after the crash in England that killed her, but none of these. One nurse was transferred on September the 4th of 1947 because of a medical condition and was admitted to the hospital at another base in Texas. One nurse was transferred to the Fort Worth Army Airfield on July 23rd of 1947, not early July as claimed by Dennis. And Dennis later claimed that the nurse's name wasn't Self, but wouldn't tell anyone what the new name was supposed to be. I guess that's pretty convenient. And none of the nurses that were at the base in July 1947 seemed to fit what Dennis claims. So assume he describes something about her, some of her characteristics, and none of them met it, like, you know, measured up to it.
Like she had big bulbous black eyes and a large head. It was only like 3 foot tall. Is that right?
Yeah, suckers on the ends of her fingers.
They did quite a bit of investigative work to find out if there was a plane crash, and they just looked in newspapers and things from around that era, and there was no, and they also looked at the National Transportation Safety Board records. There was no plane crash around that time. You know, the thing that stood out to me personally when I was watching that, now listeners, if you've listened to the show for a while, you know I'm a little bit of a military history buff, but the one thing that really stuck out to me was as soon as he starts talking about the confrontation in the hallway, he says the red-haired officer's giving him a hard time and says that he's going to disappear in the sand, and that there was a black sergeant there that said, maybe we'll just let the dogs eat him or something like that, or sick the dogs on him or something like that. Well, what stuck out to me immediately, in 1947, the armed forces were still segregated. They were not desegregated until, I believe, June of 1948. I know 1948. So that stood out to me right away. But to give Dennis the benefit of the doubt, I thought, well, maybe he just has faulty memory, right? That it wasn't 1947. Maybe he's remembering an event that happened in 1949. Maybe there was a different flying saucer crash. I don't know. But the whole thing about the nurse is pretty telling too, because first of all, he says he sends a letter. It's marked deceased. He claimed that he heard later that she'd been killed in a military plane crash. Okay, so there's no records of a plane crash. And then in another interview, he says in 1992, he said, I never did try and contact her. So then he changed his story. But he said she did join an order to become a nun after she got out of the Army. So it's so inconsistent. I mean, how can you believe this guy?
Yeah, and this was one of the points, if not the point, that caused a rift between Randle and Schmidt, our two authors who collaborated on several books about Roswell. Paul McCarthy, not McCartney, Paul McCarthy, a writer for the now defunct Omni magazine, was given the task of doing his own research into this mystery regarding Glenn Dennis and this missing nurse. Now, Randle and Donald Schmidt claimed that they had exhaustively checked everywhere and had come up with a big blank on the nurses, claiming that in cover-up conspiracy, the nurses had been systematically erased from military records, all traces being removed. So that seems pretty suspicious, but Paul McCarthy, he does his own research, and in 3 days, using only a phone, was able not only to track down the records of all the Roswell nurses, but also locate the surviving member of that group. And this is one of the things that sparked a rift between Randle and Schmidt, which eventually resulted in Randle publicly disowning Schmidt around 1995.
Yeah, so the first two books that they wrote together, Kevin Randle's a professional writer. He has over 80 books to his credit. He's best known for his UFO books and the Roswell story. But the vast majority of his books are actually historical fiction and science fiction. These books have had considerable influence on the Roswell story, right? The whole right. Roswell.
Sounds like they started out as historical fiction and moved into science fiction.
You're right. Right. Historical science fiction, I guess we should say this. Again, he co-authored these with Donald Schmidt, and as Jimmy had pointed out, once Randle had discovered that Schmidt had basically done no research, there was a major rift. Now, Schmidt has gone on to publish some other books along with, let's see, who else? He's done it with, like Kearney or something. Who is it?
That I don't know.
Yeah, because that's like where that one claim you made, or the claim about Frank Joyce reconstructing the conversation with Mac Brazel and Brazel of the stench, the aliens were somewhere else, which I'd like to point out again that nobody saw aliens at the debris site. That Jesse Marcel most certainly would have mentioned alien bodies if they existed then. Man, this guy's just like making stuff up.
I don't know. Jim Ragsdale, he saw alien bodies with golden helmets. Seems like a stand-up guy.
So we've already established that from Mac Brazel way back in 1947 in the newspaper article said that he had found the debris on June 14th, and it's laid out in the field for a while. But in the UFO crash at Roswell, they changed the date to July 2nd.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you find the debris on June the 14th, and if it has alien bodies and a full flying saucer embedded in the side of a hill, you're just like, for 2 weeks, yeah, I'm going to tend to the flock. I'll get around to that later.
So this little tidbit I'd like to bring up from the Roswell report, fact versus fiction. This is the airport's report, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it up here now. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. They said that, let me just read an excerpt. It says, an example of trying to deal with questionable claims is illustrated by the following example. One of the popular books, The UFO Crash at Roswell by Randle and Schmidt, mentioned that was reviewed claimed that the writers had submitted the names and serial numbers of over 24 personnel stationed at Roswell in July 1947 to the Veterans Administration and the Defense Department to confirm their military service. They then listed 11 of these persons by name and asked the question, why does neither the Defense Department nor the Veterans Administration have records of any of these men when we can document that they each served at the Roswell Army Airfield? In other words, they're trying to say it's a government cover-up, conspiracy, erasing information, all that sort of stuff. That claim sounded so serious that the Air Force was tasked to check these 11 names in their Personnel Records Center at St. Louis. Using only the names, since the authors did not list the serial numbers, the researcher quickly found the records readily identifiable with 8 of these persons. The other 3 had such common names that they could have had multiple possibilities. So, I mean, they basically did a half hour's worth of work and found the records. In other words, they didn't even look, okay? They just, the Schmidt guy in particular, it seems to be, did zero research. And they're just making this up, that records have disappeared or don't exist because the Air Force is like, yeah, they're right there in St. Louis.
Well, mailmen have a lot of time on their hands where they have to run from dogs. So it interrupts their UFO research. I'm just saying.
Anyway, after that was put out in the book, Randle defended the research that was done for Schmidt for quite a while. Then someone actually did a background check on Donald Schmidt.
And what'd they find?
So when the 2 books were written, Schmidt was the director of special investigations for SUFOs, and I don't know what that is.
Super UFOs.
He had claimed to have a bachelor's degree from Concordia College, a master's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and that he was pursuing his doctorate in criminology from Concordia College. Mm-hmm. Well, it turned out that Schmidt had never been a student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and that Concordia didn't offer doctorate degrees. And then in March of 1995 issue of Milwaukee Magazine, there was a letter about Schmidt regarding the question of how Schmidt earns his living. He delivers mail out of the Hartford, Wisconsin post office. If you believe half of what he tells you, you are a prospect for buying a bridge.
It's Cliff from Cheers.
That is from one of his co-workers, okay?
Good judge of character, that man.
The writer of the original article stated that and insisted he earned his living as a medical illustrator. However, Hartford postmaster Ken Epler confirms that Schmidt is employed as a full-time carrier. Schmidt has worked at the Hartford post office since 1974. Here's somebody that's publishing a UFO book, says that they have all these credentials, and it turns out he lied about all that. You know what? His story lives on. The cover-up still exists. The conspiracy still exists. I mean, there are so many stories, so many things when you just take another look at it. Look, I'm not just repeating what other researchers have said. I read the book myself and with very little found inconsistencies with the story as it exists now and the way it was first told. You know, they just keep embellishing it, making it bigger and bigger. I mean, there was just a story on the History Channel last year, right? I mean, on Roswell, New Witnesses. I mean, it's become a cash cow. Anytime there's a witness that is telling the truth, they say, well, they're just part of the conspiracy, right? The government got to them. They're threatening them or they're part of it.
So this leads us into what could have possibly crashed in Roswell in 1947 that could have been mistaken as a flying saucer. We can start with a taped video interview with Haut conducted by Fred Whitling for the Fund of UFO Research in July of 1990. Whiting asked Haut if he could remember Blanchard ever mentioning the flying saucer. Now, you'll remember that it was Colonel Blanchard. He was a West Point graduate, rose in ranks during World War II, and by 1947 was considered a rising star by the Air Force. And in 1966, he was a 4-star general, vice chief of staff, and a sure bet for Joint Chiefs. But unfortunately, he died from a massive heart attack at the Pentagon.
It's probably whenever he first read about the Roswell report.
It was probably like,
found out them aliens were real.
Exactly. When asked whether or not Blanchard had ever mentioned the flying saucer matter after the official weather balloon line was established, Haut replied that he did at a staff's meeting a week or two later. He recalled Blanchard opening the meeting with a comment something like this: "Well, we sure shot ourselves in the foot with that balloon fiasco. It was just something from a project at Alamogordo that some of the guys were here on the base later too. Anyway, it's done and over with." Keep in mind that this was made well before a UFO researcher by the name of Robert Todd was able to link a New York team at Alamogordo and Project Mogul to the Roswell incident.
Yeah, so again, that's the researcher that filed the FOIA request for Jesse Marcel's military records. I mean, instead of ignoring the facts, he went after the facts, and then he chased it down, and before the government released that this was Project Mogul, he had already suspected it was Project Mogul.
Now, Project Mogul is fascinating because it actually starts in Japan. In the 1940s, Japan was mapping out air currents, and they would release balloons on the western side of the island and collect it on the eastern side of the island. Now, some of the researchers noticed that strong air currents, which traveled across the Pacific at about 30,000 feet, could carry the balloons all the way across the Pacific to North America. Using that knowledge, in 1944, the Japanese military made what many experts considered to be the first intercontinental weapon system. Explosive devices attached to paper balloons that went across the ocean at that 30,000-foot range. Now, it had an interesting device that was attached to it, so that if the balloon got too high, it would release some of the helium and lower it. And then if it got too low, it would release some of the ballast and raise it. Now, a small percentage of these balloons actually made it all the way across the ocean. And as a matter of fact, it actually killed some civilians. It killed 5 civilians in Oregon that were having a picnic. But it was after the war when the military was trying to figure out a way that they could spy on Russia without Russia knowing it, because they didn't want to create an international incident by actually flying over into the airspace. And the range that planes could go at that time was not at 30,000 feet. It's well below that. So they came up with the idea of using the same technology that Japan had used and started a project with Project Mogul, where they would have these balloons fly over Russia from west to east in an attempt to gather information. And what they were looking for more specifically was information on radioactive materials in the air that would indicate nuclear testing of sorts.
Yeah, keep in mind that the Soviets had yet to develop an atomic weapon. At this time, the United States was the only country in the world that had the secrets of nuclear power. And what Jimmy's talking about is the jet stream. We did have aircraft that would fly at that altitude, but at the time it wasn't believed that the Soviets had one or had any way of intercepting these balloons. It was, an old-fashioned spy plane, really. And but also it had acoustical sensors. If there was a loud sound like a nuclear bomb going off, it would record that as well.
Exactly. So this project that was being put together was considered top secret A1, which was the same level as the Manhattan Project was, the building of the atomic bomb. Any release of information about this project to the public was just something that wouldn't fly for the military, which is why there was a cover-up of the Roswell incident. But it wasn't because of a flying saucer. It was because of Project Mogul, and it makes perfect sense.
There were 2 government reports. The first one was published in 1995, and it's called The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. This is published by the United States Air Force. Congressman Stephen Schiff was a representative from New Mexico, had a lot of phone calls, a lot of letters from his constituents regarding the Roswell incident, and they wanted to know about the flying saucer. As a result of this, the General Accounting Office started this investigation. They put it on the Air Force because that seemed to be based on all the rumors of who was covering all this up. But one thing that was really important was that the Air Force declassification and review team and anything regarding this incident, they had the permission to release anyone from any kind of oath of secrecy relating to the Roswell incident. Whether it was a flying saucer or Project Mogul, if I had sworn oath or if I had been told this is top secret, you can't talk about it. But then if these guys showed up and handed me this piece of paper that said you're released from that oath, then I can talk about it without any fear of retribution. When you get into this report, I've read the whole thing, read parts of it many times. You get into the whole report, man, it is very detailed. The number of people that were interviewed, the amount of investigation that was done, the records they went through. I have no doubt the Air Force did exactly what they said they did. I really think they tried to get to the bottom of how this rumor started. So I'm going to go to the executive summary. They explain what the Roswell incident is. Of course, we talked about that for 2 weeks. Let's start here. What the Roswell incident was not. It was not an airplane crash. Of all the things that are documented and tracked by the Air Force, among the most detailed and scrupulous are airplane crashes. In fact, records of air crashes go back to the first years of military flight. Safety records and reports are available for all crashes and involve serious damage, injury, death, and or combination of these factors. These records also include incidents involving experimental or classified aircraft. The United States Air Force records show that between June 24th, 1947 and July 28th, there were 5 crashes in New Mexico alone involving an A-26C, a P-51N, a C-82A, a P-80A, and a PQ-14B. However, none of these occurred on the dates in question nor in the area in question. Another thing it was not a missile crash. A crashed or errant missile, usually described as a captured German V-2 or one of its variants, is sometimes set forth as a possible explanation for the debris recovered near Roswell, since much of this testing was done at nearby White Sands and was secret at the time. It would be logical to assume that the government would handle any missile mishap under tight security, particularly if the mishap occurred on private land. But from the records reviewed by the Air Force, there was nothing located to suggest that this was the case. Another thing it was not a nuclear accident. One of the areas considered was whatever happened near Roswell may have involved nuclear weapons. This was a logical area of concern since the 509th Bomb Group was the only military unit in the world at the time that had access to nuclear weapons. And of course, it goes into how they found all that. Another thing that it was not an extraterrestrial craft.
How can you claim that, man?
I love this part of it because really they sum it up pretty nicely. The Air Force research found absolutely no indication that what happened near Roswell in 1947 involved any type of extraterrestrial spacecraft. This, of course, is the crux of the entire matter. Pro-UFO persons who obtain a copy of this report at this point will most probably begin the cover-up is still on. Nevertheless, the research indicates absolutely no evidence of any kind that a spaceship crashed near Roswell, or that any alien occupants were recovered in some secret military operation or otherwise. This does not mean, however, that the early Air Force was not concerned about UFOs. In the early days, UFO meant unidentified flying object, which literally translated as some object in the air that was not readily identifiable. It did not mean, as the term has evolved in today's language, to equate to alien spaceships. Records from this period reviewed by Air Force researchers, as well as those cited by the authors mentioned before, do indicate that the United States Air Force was seriously concerned about the inability to adequately identify unknown flying objects reported in American airspace. All the records, however, indicated that the focus of concern was not on aliens, hostile or otherwise, but on the Soviet Union. Many documents from that period speak to the possibility of the development of secret Soviet aircraft overflying U.S. airspace. The research revealed only one official document that indicated that there was any activity of any type that pertained to UFOs and Roswell in July of 1947. This was a small section of the July historical record for the 509th Bomb Group and the Roswell Army Airfield that stated the Office of Public Information was quite busy during the month answering inquiries on the flying disc, which was reported to be in possession of the 509th Bomb Group. The object turned out to be a radar tracking balloon. Additionally, this history showed that the 509th commander, Colonel Blanchard, went on leave on July 8, 1947, which would be somewhat unusual maneuver for a person involved in a supposed first-ever recovery of extraterrestrial materials. And of course, detractors claimed that Blanchard was trying to elude the press, but was actually on the scene recovering the flying saucer. The history and morning reports also showed that the subsequent activity levels at Roswell during the month were mostly mundane and not indicative of unusual high-level activity, expenditure of manpower, resources, or security. Likewise, the researchers found no indication of heightened activity anywhere else in the military in July. The message traffic or orders, and that includes classified traffic, there were no indications of warnings, notice of alerts, or higher tempo of operational activity reported that would logically be generated if an alien craft whose intentions were unknown entered U.S. territory. To believe that such operational and high-level security activity could be conducted solely by relying on an unsecured telecommunications or personal contact without creating any records of such activity certainly stretches the imagination of those who have served in the military, who know that paperwork of some kind is necessary to accomplish even emergency, highly classified, sensitive tasks. An example of activity sometimes cited by pro-UFO writers to illustrate the point that something unusual was going on was the travel of Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, commander of Air Materiel Command, to New Mexico in July of 1947. Actually, records were located indicating that Twining went to the Bomb Commander's Course on July 8th, along with a number of other general officers, and requested orders to do so a month before on June 5th. It is also alleged that General Hoyt Vandenberg had been involved directing activity regarding events at Roswell. General Vandenberg's personal papers stored at the Library of Congress did indicate on July 7th he was busy with a flying disc incident. However, this particular incident involved Ellington Field, Texas, and Spokane, Washington Depot. After much discussion and information gathering on this incident, it was learned to be a hoax. There is no similar mention of his personal interest or involvement in Roswell events except in the newspapers. And they said these are just two examples that indicate that if some event happened that was one of the watershed happenings in human history, the U.S. military certainly acted in an unconcerned and cavalier manner. In an actual case, the military would have had to order thousands of soldiers and airmen, not only at Roswell but throughout the U.S., to act nonchalantly, pretend to conduct and report business as usual, and to generate absolutely no paperwork of a suspicious nature, while simultaneously anticipating that 20 years or more into the future, people would have available a comprehensive Freedom of Information Act that would give them great leeway to review and explore government documents. The records indicate that none of this happened, or if it did, it was controlled by a security system so efficient and tight that no one, U.S. or otherwise, has been able to duplicate it since. If such a system had been in effect at the time, it would have also been used to protect our atomic secrets from the Soviets, which history has showed obviously was not the case. The records reviewed confirmed that no such sophisticated and efficient security system existed.
Man, I want that security system. That'd be awesome.
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you can look around the issue, right? I mean, I can't trust these researchers. We got Schmidt saying that their records have been erased, and then the Air Force goes to St. Louis and they find all the records of those servicemen, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Air Force looked into this, but it just makes a lot of sense. No matter how you think about it, the fact that this cover-up exists, this huge conspiracy, and under threat of death and all these other things, but then all these witnesses keep coming forward. You know, where's the threat of death there? Where's anybody ever been threatened by the government about talking about Roswell? Nowhere.
I've been threatened.
You know?
I get threatened all the time.
And you know,
where's my check?
And the military people that were there, they're just part of the cover-up. You know, it's just ridiculous. So let's talk about what it was, and that was Project Mogul.
Yeah, you want me to do that? Is that your segue?
Yeah.
Segue.
Segue.
Charles B. Moore, no relation to the Moore of the books written about Roswell from a UFO perspective, but Charles B. Moore was one of the 3 surviving Project Mogul scientists who was identified in and interviewed for the Air Force report. So obviously he's part of the conspiracy, but if you don't believe that part, he goes on to talk about the debris, about the strong connection between a flight number 4 of the Mogul project and what was recovered in Roswell by Mac Brazel. The debris that Brazel picked up, and which was later taken to Fort Worth, Texas for inspection by Brigadier General Roger Ramey, that we talked about all of this before, says that some of the debris consisted of patches of smelly, smoky, gray rubber-like material, which is consistent with the neoprene balloons used in New York, NYU, so that's New York University flight number 4, because they were tasked with coming up with these balloons for this Mogul project that we've already talked about. Now, when Warrant Officer Irving Newton saw the debris in Ramey's office, he immediately recognizes pieces of it as a radar target. Now, Moore points out that the Ramey photograph show parts of more than one reflector. Flight 4 contained 3 signal cores LL ML307B RAWIN targets. Many of the witnesses of the debris describe the tape with flower designs or hieroglyphics, as they say, on the targets. Now, Moore recalls that the reinforcing tape used on the NYU targets had curious markings. There were about 4 of us who were involved in this, he says, and all remember that our targets had sort of a stylized flower-like design. I've prepared in my life probably more than 100 of these targets for flight, and every time I've prepared one of these targets, I have always wondered what the purpose of the tape markings were. But a major named John Peterson laughed and said, "What do you expect when you get your targets made by a toy factory?"
Right.
So the radar targets contained small islets, and Moore showed the NMSR audience a similar target with the islets, which were described also by everyone who originally touched the material, from Mac Brazel to his daughter to the other people that were on Cavett and Marcel mentioned the islets. So Brazel's daughter, Bessie Brazel Schreiber, in a 1979 interview conducted by author William Moore, no relation to Charles B. Moore, described some aluminum ring-shaped objects in the debris that looked like pipe intake collars or the necks of balloons. The mention of the rings appears in William Moore's transcript of the interview, but wasn't included in his book. She estimates they were 4 inches around, and she says she could put her hand through them. Now, Charles Moore points out that Flight 4 carried several 3-inch diameter aluminum rings for assisting with the launching of the balloon train, as well as larger rings used to hold the sono buoys. These were cut from cylindrical tubing stock, then used to prevent damage to the ropes. Now, Sheridan Cavett, the one who helped Marcel collect the materials with Major Jesse Marcel, said that they located a black box in the wreckage. Now, Moore says the NYU crew routinely packed batteries for the acoustic equipment in a black box. So all of this starts to fit together. Now, when you add in the weather patterns that occurred at that time and the launching of the balloon and the time that the batteries ran out and they lost sight of the balloon, it all coincides with the date of which Mac Brazel and his son Vernon come across the wreckage in the New Mexico desert just outside of Corona.
And the fact that it laid out in the sun for several weeks made it become discolored.
Right. It was 10 days between the time they lost contact with it to the time Mac Brazel found it.
Because even the people that describe the wreckage of the UFO is consistent with what people who said, oh, it wasn't a flying saucer. I mean, the debris is consistent. They're all describing the same thing. The difference is when you get into, for instance, Jesse Marcel Jr. was 11 years old at the time when his dad collected this material that he stopped by his home and showed it to his family. When Jesse Marcel Jr. described it, and now he's passed away, and again, he was an honorable person and served in the military. But, you know, in his own mind, I'm sure he believed what he handled was a piece of UFO material. And his thing was like, oh, they're just trying to run down my dad and say bad things about him. And of course, the conspiracy people are going to say, well, they erased all that information about him serving in combat or that he was a pilot because it's conspiracy, right? It's a way to discredit him. But anyway, Jesse Marcel Jr., when he described the material, and this, he had an affidavit filed in 1991. He said there were 3 categories of debris: a thick foil-like metallic gray substance, a brittle brownish black plastic-like material, and there were fragments of what appeared to be I-beams. On the inner surface of the I-beam, there appeared to be a type of writing. This writing was a purple-violet hue, and it had an embossed appearance. The figures were composed of curved geometric shapes. It had no resemblance to Russian, Japanese, or any other foreign language. It resembled hieroglyphics, but it had no animal-like characters. Okay, he's describing the same debris. Now, in his mind, he's seeing it as UFO debris because his dad came in and told him. He's 11 years old. You know, and again, we go through all these testimonies, whether they're pro-UFO people or not. it's the same debris. I mean, they're all describing the tinfoil, the little beams, and the brittle plastic stuff, right?
Yeah, so you and I are on the same page here. I think we come to the same conclusion.
So I have one last thing I want to say. This is it, because there's so much here.
I don't believe you.
We had talked about Newton,
Isaac Newton, Fig Newton.
Well, actually, I wanted to mention a little bit about Cavett. He also was there. He was the plainclothes CNC officer. It was Lieutenant Colonel Cavett, who was still alive whenever the Air Force did their report. It says here that Cavett is credited in all claims of having accompanied Major Marcel to the ranch to recover the debris. Although there does not appear to be much dispute that Cavett was involved in material recovery, other claims about him prevail in the popular literature. He is sometimes portrayed as a closed-mouthed or sometimes even sinister conspirator who was one of the early individuals who kept the secret of Roswell from getting out. Other things about him have been alleged, including the claim that he wrote a report of the incident at the time that was never surfaced. He had firsthand knowledge he was still alive, so they decided to interview him and get a signed sworn statement. Now, this is again from the Air Force. Cavett was interviewed May 24th at his home.
He was sitting in a chair holding a white cat, petting it with a ring on his finger.
Yeah, it was video. It was tape recorded. There's a transcript in the book if you want to read the whole thing. But he said that Cavett related that he had been contacted on numerous occasions by UFO researchers and had willingly talked with many of them. However, he felt that he had oftentimes been misrepresented or had his comments taken out of context so that their true meaning was changed. He stated unequivocally, however, that the material he recovered consisted of a reflective sort of material like aluminum foil, and some tin bamboo-like sticks, he thought at the time, and continued to do so today. That what he found was a weather balloon and has told other private researchers that. He also remembers finding a small black box, the type of instrument which he thought was probably a radioscone. He also reviewed the famous Ramey Marcel photographs of the wreckage taken at Fort Worth, and is often, of course, claimed by UFO researchers to be switched out by the remnants of a balloon. And he identified the materials depicted in those photos as consistent with the materials that he recovered from the ranch. He also stated that he had never taken any kind of oath or signed any agreement not to talk about this incident, and he had never been threatened by anyone in the government because of it. He did not even know the incident was claimed to be anything unusual until he was interviewed in the early 1980s.
He was also very appreciative of the three little big-headed children with big eyes and three fingers that helped him collect the debris and load it in the back of the Jeep.
All right, so this is the last thing I want to talk about.
All right.
The very last thing. So when I talk about Jesse Marcel, he's obviously embellished this story.
Sure.
And I've asked myself why. Now, for years, when I've thought about this, after I first come to this realization that this is all just not true, this is all just something that's been blown out of proportion to make money and to keep this big mystery rolling, the government conspiracy and UFO tech. And, it started out with a little bit of debris. Now they found fiber optics and all this other stuff that was never reported the first time. But I've asked myself, why did Jesse Marcel tell this story? And at first, I thought, well, it's obvious he likes telling tall tales. He exaggerated his service in the military. He's on his ham radio. He probably enjoyed telling these stories. Then when I read this one thing in the book, this is Irving Newton. He was weather station guy that General Ramey had asked to come down. We've already talked about him a little bit. But he was still alive. He was located and interviewed. Newton was a weather officer assigned to Fort Worth who was on duty when the Roswell debris was sent there in 1947. He was told that he was to report to General Ramey's office to view the material. And he said, I walked into the general's office where this supposed flying saucer was lying all over the floor. As soon as I saw it, I giggled and I asked if that was the flying saucer. I told them that this was a balloon and a Rowan target, which is the radar target. Newton also stated that while I was examining the debris, Major Marcel was picking up pieces of the target sticks and trying to convince me that some of the notations on the sticks were alien writings. There were figures on the sticks, lavender or pink in color, appeared to be weather-faded markings with no rhyme or reason. He did not convince me that these were alien writings. Newton concluded his statement by relating that during the ensuing years, I've been interviewed by many authors. I have been quoted and misquoted. The facts remained as indicated above. I was not influenced during the original interview nor today to provide anything but what I know to be true, and that is the material I saw in General Ramey's office was the remains of a balloon and a Roland target. So what I'm getting at is that all this time I thought, well, Jesse Marcel knew it wasn't a flying saucer. He just wanted to embellish the truth, right? To tell a tall tale. But then when I read that I think Jesse Marcel thought it was a flying saucer. That makes sense, right? I mean, he's going out there already because Brazel said, I found a flying saucer on the Foster Ranch. Goes out there and he thinks I'm gathering up a flying saucer, stops by his house before he gets back to the base, shows his kids, shows his wife, look, it's alien writing and stuff. And then he goes back to the base or when they get to, fly to Fort Worth and get to General Ramey's office, here's somebody that knows what it is, but apparently Marcel still wants to believe it's a flying saucer. So, you know what I think? I think he thought he was telling the truth.
Yeah, and want to say face.
He was wrong.
Want to say face in front of everybody.
I don't think he outright lied. I think he was just wrong. I mean, even though he changed some of the story as he went along, but he admitted that the photographs he's in with the debris, it's very easy to see that material is one of these radar targets. When you see pictures of the radar targets, I mean, there's no way that could be a coincidence, man. There's no way. I mean, it's so clearly not a flying saucer.
I'm pretty sure somebody got to him first. There's a conspiracy beneath the conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the problem with these kind of stories. It's like anybody, like the Newton guy, they're going, oh, well, he's part of the conspiracy, or the Cavett guy, right? He's part of the conspiracy. So in other words, the witnesses that are still alive, and then, DuBose, they got him quoted as saying it's above top secret, but he never said it was a flying saucer, right? I mean, they interviewed him. He's just saying it's above top secret, but they put it in context with this whole flying saucer story. And they're like, here, we got a corroborating witness. And then as far as all the stories are concerned about finding alien bodies and finding crashed saucers, man, I can't go. I mean, maybe there's a crashed saucer out there somewhere, but it's not here. It is not what Jesse Marcel
At
found.
least that's what this appears to be, right? You and I agree that this is the case.
Yeah.
But it's possible we could be missing something or we could be wrong. It's possible. Not likely, possible. So let's just challenge our listeners out there. I mean, we certainly weren't able to cover all the different interviews that were done over the years and all of the different witnesses. We've, at least on the show, off the show we have. So if there's any particular interview or witness out there that our listeners think that we should have considered and discussed more, or an alternative theory that is supported by facts or logic or reason, or something that can't be refuted, or you think can't be refuted, let us know, because if we're wrong or if we're missing something, maybe there was a saucer that crashed that at the same time that Project Mogul crashed. Let's say that happened, and there's evidence for it. Let us know what that evidence is or where it's located. We'd love to hear about it, and we'd love to look at it, and then we can talk about it on the show and just follow up on this. But for both of us right now, we're fairly certain that Roswell was Project Mogul, crashed in the desert, located and misidentified by military personnel, and then the cover-up was for Project Mogul because it was a top-secret project at the time, and then this all comes out in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s.
Keep in mind, too, I think General Ramey, not only was it a classified project, and it was put forth in something I read somewhere, that Ramey may have not really been aware of Project Mogul just because he was general in the Air Force. I think General Ramey just wanted to put a lid on this thing. That's why he's telling everybody to stop talking. And let me handle this. We got to put this story to bed, man, because as soon as that news report went out, I mean, I heard, I think it was Frank Joyce, or I can't remember who I saw interviewed. They said one of the first call they picked up was from London.
Oh, that's Frank Joyce,
and,
yeah.
I mean, it was...
That was Frank Joyce, I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Yeah, and it's all over the world. People's wanting to know about the flying saucer. So, and I'm sure it was going on not just in Roswell, but all over the country. Every Air Force base, everybody is going nuts about this thing. And he wanted to get a lid on it. And that's why he's telling them not to talk. It's like, let me handle this. It's a weather balloon. Let's move on.
Yep.
And he may have been aware of it, saying it was top secret to DuBose. And of course, it's just like you had pointed out, when we look at Project Mogul, using the jet stream to float these balloons over the Soviet Union, we certainly didn't want to admit to the Soviet Union that we were spying on their country.
Or that we had the capability even.
Yeah, even possible that we could. And they probably didn't even have radar at the time. But I think
I'm not sure they have radar now.
Yeah, well, in 1947, though, they, like us, they grabbed up some German scientists, and we may have shared radar with them. I don't know it. The type of radar that we used, the Allies used, was developed by the British and was far superior to the Liechtenstein radar system that the Germans used. So that was one thing they lagged behind us. Everybody always believes the Germans were so far ahead of us technologically. There were some things they were, some things they wasn't. Atomic bomb. They weren't even close to developing an atomic weapon. So no long-range bombers.
I'd love to see their face. They're like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Was ist das?
Yeah, I think and also it's like if we had this super secret conspiracy security system, we would have used it to protect our atomic secrets, which obviously didn't work because they leaked out to the Soviets and they were able to develop a bomb by 1949. And it was revealed much later, they had spies all over the place. So, and I know proponents of the UFO theory are going to say, yeah, but this was smaller. They were able to contain it, and it was just a few people that knew about it, and they kept it, they just looked at the traffic, like the orders that were being carried out, the manpower that was being used, all the communications. It just showed that nothing was going on that day, other than the footnote about the newspaper release. They actually found records of that, how busy the phones were at the Roswell Air Force Base, but that's it. They said they would have, mobilized all kinds of people. We're talking about an extraterrestrial spacecraft with occupants crashes in our country. I think they would have mobilized a few troops, don't you? They would have thought, what is this, an invasion? Right? I think you would have seen the military go into high alert. There's absolutely no evidence of that.
Yeah, they would have at least mobilized Carl and Doug, the two privates that were really gung-ho and go-getters.
All right. Well, listeners, we have jawed about this once again for a long time. I hope you all have enjoyed part 1 and 2. I've got to tell you, Jimmy, I loved doing the research on this project. I have been really into it, man.
It was a lot of fun.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. The stuff on the Japanese balloons was fascinating.
Yeah, that's really cool too. I'd heard about that. Yeah, the jet stream, we didn't know about it. And when we first sent, we developed a B-29, which was a high-altitude bomber. It was designed to bomb at 30,000 feet. We were the only country in the world that had this kind of technology. The B-29 was developed. It was a high-altitude bomber, long-range bomber, the only country in the world with this kind of capability. And when we started bombing Japan, we finally got close enough to bomb Japan. It's like, they're using the bomb sites and stuff, and the bombs are going crazy. It's going all over the place. And we didn't know why. The Japanese knew about the jet stream, but they didn't share it. But we didn't. And really, they discovered it during trying to bomb Japan because the bombing was terribly inaccurate because of those very fast winds at those kind of altitudes above Japan.
Right.
All right. Well, I think that is going to do it for this episode. Next week, Jimmy and I will be doing episode 50. And what we're going to do is a little bit of a retrospective. We've been doing this podcast now for a year. And listeners, I know we've got some of you out there that have been with us since episode 1, and we can't tell you how much we appreciate it. But next week, we're going to take stock of where we are now. So when we first started the show, the very first episode was, well, what do you think about this? What do you believe in this? And Jimmy and I went back and forth on a few things, and we're going to talk about how our perspectives have changed in the past year since we've actually dug into these topics and done some research on some of these things. And we know we got a long way to go on a lot of other topics, but I think it should be a lot of fun to look at that.
Oh, definitely. I can't wait. I have a lot of my views have changed. They have progressed.
Yeah. So anyway, with all that being said, this is Stephen Hawk signing out, and we'll see you next week.
And Jimmy Coe, keep your eyes to the skies and your feet on the ground. We'll see you next week.
Hey, look out, man. Is that a piece of alien debris? Oh, never mind. That's a gum wrapper. I thought a flying saucer just crashed in my living room.
Well, you give me half of the proceeds for the book, I'll say anything you want.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, my God. We just got to wait about 40 years before we publish it.
That's right. Bubblegum wrapper found.
Yeah.
Alien vehicle recovered.
Yeah. All right, man. Let's get out of here.
Adios, amigos. That's all for this week's episode of Cosmic Sponge. Please don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have any questions or have a story you'd like to share, you can contact us using our email account at firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. If you'd like to support the show, consider becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/cosmicsponge, where you get access to exclusive content, including our Weird Wonders news and stories released every week. To explore everything Cosmic Sponge has to offer, including other ways to support the show, head on over to our website at www.cosmicsponge.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.